So yeah, hopefully this is quite a good introduction to the overall concept and theme for the series of events, but for today as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about applying an API first strategy to your organization and what that really means. I'm going to talk perhaps largely towards an enterprise flavored position in the world of API first. So, if you're working in a larger organization that's perhaps having to deal with a lot of, legacy infrastructure or legacy problems, or thinking about the future in terms of where your business needs to go and what you're trying to do with your APIs, that's perhaps what you're going to hear most about in this session. But I'm going to cover a pretty wide gambit of things as well. So, first of all, I suppose I should introduce myself. I'm Ross Garrett, responsible for product marketing at Axway. Let's hope the marketing piece of that title doesn't put everybody off. I do have a computer science background, so I'm not just about pictures and waving my arms about, but I do a lot of hand waving. Yes, so we're going to talk about enterprise architecture, and we're going to think about, some of the ways that enterprise IT perhaps is being forced to change. I think we're all very aware of how and why enterprise IT has had to at least deal with change. This thing called the mobile device and mobile applications kind of came along and changed the entire world for a lot of people. It opened up a whole new economy of applications, and it made enterprise organizations in particular think very differently around what their IT infrastructure looked like, what it needed to actually do, and what sort of developers or what sort of audience they were actually delivering infrastructure for, and so the world of mobile and mobility in general, both for consumer apps and employee apps and just connectivity, has really forced everybody to think differently, and there are a range of new business requirements that kind of come along with that. But there continues to be a wide range of new product categories that are developing all the time. So you'll see people with new smartwatches. You'll see a wide range of new types of integration models required for those types of devices. There are, I don't know whether anybody has seen these new little Amazon buttons. Has anybody seen this announcement from Amazon? So basically, when you're running out of washing powder, you just press the button and it automatically adds that product to your Amazon shopping list and gets it delivered to you. Quite brilliant, right? So there's no thinking about it. You're there, I'm out of washing powder, press the button, and it suddenly arrives 2 days later or whatever. And so the point here is that whilst change was perhaps started, the ball started rolling with thinking about mobile and thinking about how people would deliver products in a mobile-oriented environment. That's definitely not the entire picture today. And so really, in effect, what we're saying is that this new world, this new environment for business, doesn't really have any boundaries to it at all. We can't simply say, we'll develop stuff just for mobile. We'll develop stuff firstly for mobile, perhaps. We used to use that term quite a bit. Mobile first, all applications will be done mobile first. And that's really not the point anymore, because applications expand way beyond just a mobile environment. They expand way beyond the web environment. And so they start to, eke out into lots of different types of products, lots of different environments, lots of different platforms. And so what basically we're saying is that architecting for mobile simply isn't enough. This world of digital business doesn't really have any border. And so digital products that span all of these environments together are really quite important. So when I think about the world of IT and enterprise IT, I said we were going to keep coming back to that. What does that really mean? And I think expectations have changed quite considerably. In the past, enterprise architecture was able to focus on a bunch of known problems. So when you developed things like APIs a few years ago, you knew exactly what problems you were trying to solve. You were architecting for known types of integration patterns, where you clearly understood who was consuming the APIs, how they were going to be used, in what environment, by which products, by which technologies. And as we said, change kind of created by the mobile application wave has entirely changed expectations here. Today's enterprise must architect for stuff that they can't possibly know about yet. We have to consider that, you know, enterprise IT and that world of a strictly controlled IT infrastructure is no longer valid. And we have to think about, you know, integrating to a lot of different things and stuff that we can't possibly know about yet. And I wanted to pick up a lesson here from our friends at Amazon, because you'll have seen this 100 million times perhaps, but I think it's always worth reiterating the point, because especially in an enterprise context, I think it's important that we have a driving force, a factor that kind of pushes us towards change. Because if I was to think about how enterprise IT actually adopts new technologies, it's not exactly leading edge typically. So it's interesting whether it's, you know, new market demands or simply a mandate from the CEO saying we're going to do things differently. Well, this is Amazon's approach to doing things differently. You know, Bezos pretty much said, if you don't expose APIs as a way to communicate between teams, between products, between different parts of the organization, then you know, you're going to be fired pretty much, right? And it's not the being fired part that's really the important statement here. It's the fact that this is the way he wanted the business to interact. He was architecting the entire organization, both from an organizational standpoint and a technology standpoint, to think about the future, to think about how they were going to be able to do things more easily, with more agility, but with more control and visibility ultimately across the entire platform. And so APIs, and specifically, as we said, web APIs here, were the tools in which he was mandating the organization was going to do that. So to come back to the notion, or this idea of API first, and the title of my presentation, putting APIs as the first part of your strategy for digital innovation is really important, but you really have to think of them as first-class citizens. The products themselves are really important, but the APIs that power those products are fundamental. They're the foundation by which we build everything, by which we talk to any platform, by which different teams talk to each other. And so they really must be treated as first-class citizens. And so what does this really mean then? If we think about API first, I really wanted to take a step back, perhaps, look at, you know, where we are, where we've got to today, and how we kind of map this path towards API first. Because it's very rare that we get to start with a blank sheet of paper, at least in an enterprise context. There's probably lots of people here that have, you know, that are working in organizations that started with a blank sheet of paper, a startup environment where your API is, you know, the first thing you thought about, or maybe the API is the product that you sell. There are several organizations that, you know, your API is the only way that their customers actually interact with their company. But for the rest of us, they have to go back and think, well, from the very beginnings, what do I want my APIs to do? What are my APIs? And so that's really, for me, the very first step. And this perhaps seems really obvious, but I think we have to consider the first thing being, well, what are these APIs? Let's define what we want our organization to look like in terms of interfaces. I'm not saying this should be a static catalog. I'm just saying that we should consider what is it that we want these things to actually be, and how do we define them. And so perhaps in contrast to the past and things like service-oriented architecture, which is a horrible bad word that nobody likes to say anymore, but if we think about that, I really don't believe that we approach the world of APIs or services in that world as products, as things that represented business problems. I think what we actually did was think, here's a bunch of integration problems that have to be solved, and that's how we define what APIs are going to be published from our organization. So, thinking about your APIs in the first instance and what they're going to be, I think, is really the first step in terms of this API-first approach to integration. And so, there's again some pretty fundamental things to consider here. Again, but when we thought about services back, a few years ago, we developed a suite of services that were going to be available. People came along and built those services, and then they went away. The people went away. There was nobody that actually had any ownership of it. And so when we think about API first and APIs as products, I think this is one of the fundamentals that is very well aligned with our concept of life cycle today. Developing an API needs to be managed from conception to retirement as a product. It is a first-class citizen in its own right and needs to be implemented and managed and controlled as a product that has that same life cycle as everything else. The next piece that I think is important is API design in general. And so I guess the question I would ask here is, again, in an enterprise context, how useful are your APIs today? We live in a world where there's probably a whole bunch of things that aren't quite fit for purpose. So when we developed all of this SOAP infrastructure, and although we said that SOAP may be the right job to do a particular task, that's great. If it is, perfect. But if there's new requirements, if we're thinking about things like mobile integration or integrating with cloud-based products or thinking about the Internet of connected things that don't really work well with SOAP interfaces, then how useful is your API in that context? Does your IT infrastructure actually support all of the integration needs that you have today? And I would suspect that in most cases it actually doesn't at all. And if it doesn't fit the picture for today's integration needs, it certainly can't be forward-looking towards future integration needs. So what are tomorrow's problems, and how are you going to deal with them? And is your API infrastructure designed and intended to support those new types of integration things? One of the books that I think is really interesting here, and we're perhaps we've seen this before, but the idea of a useful design is very interesting. So Donald Norman said, "The value of a well-designed object is when it has such a rich set of affordances that the people who use it can do things with it that the designer never imagined." And this is really quite fundamental when we think about APIs, because what we're saying is, when I understand, when I start down the process of developing an API and designing an API, I really have to think about the ways in which it might be used that we don't even know about yet. And so it's really interesting to bring this concept in. And when Donald Norman was talking about it, he was talking about a whole range of physical products, but the same principles can be applied to really any type of product, and APIs in particular. So let's bring that notion into the world of web or of enterprise integration. So incorporating this concept of web-based discoverability and integration when you think about your APIs. I think it's important to note that the standard concepts of integration and RPC-style APIs is perhaps not fit for purpose when we think about the future needs. Again, if we're starting at the very beginnings of where your API infrastructure is today, can it actually support new types of integration models? Or are you forcing this coupling? Are you forcing applications to have some defined knowledge of each other based upon the interfaces that you've constructed? Or are you thinking about how applications could adapt or change as the interface changes? And so embracing the concept of the web here and bringing the idea of web-based integration into the enterprise notion of API architecture, I think, is really important. And I'm not going to talk about hypermedia-style APIs particularly today, but I think it is important to consider how hypermedia is completely different, a completely different approach, a more evolved approach for sure, a more mature approach to API design compared to perhaps the standard way of doing basic RPC-style interfaces. And so ultimately, your APIs have to be able to support a bunch of things that the designer, you, have never really considered yet. You have to think about integration problems that you haven't considered yet, or products that don't exist yet. The next example that I'm going to talk about is the idea of dealing with the stuff that exists, the old stuff that exists in your organization. And I think there's quite a good analogy here by taking the mullet haircut. Everybody must be familiar with this. So the idea being business in the front all looks very proper and well put together, and then there's this party going on at the back. An interesting style for sure, certainly living in the past, I think. Just looking around the room. Yes, I think it's definitely in the past. But so to kind of apply this to the world of APIs, I think there's this concept of the API mullet. And so this is actually quite a good thing because we can use this, business in the front. Everything looks great and well presented and put together and everything, kind of works and seems presentable. But it's kind of hiding a mishmash of tangled web in the back, right? Your old architecture that doesn't have useful web APIs, or maybe it's a bunch of older SOAP-style services that don't work really well in the context of mobility or cloud-based integration. And so when I say stop living in the past, what I really mean is there's usually a lot of legacy stuff that has to stay where it is. We can't just rip and replace all this old stuff, but API management actually gives us a way to extend and reuse a lot of that by translating older interfaces, even if they're SOAP-based interfaces that perhaps are not that old, that they can be turned into something that's more appropriate for the new types of integration that we require. And so, whilst your business probably depends and runs on these older pieces of infrastructure, the future of how your business is more competitive and relevant is going to be depending on new products that are built on APIs that are more flexible and agile in principle. So web APIs are kind of extending the reach and utility of these existing business services. The fourth one is a little bit of a sidestep, I guess, but I think it's important because what I'm really talking about here is cloud-based integration, and I think in a lot of cases, businesses, or really any organization, is struggling with the notion of cloud adoption. What does it mean to build a suite of cloud-based applications, or how do I leverage off-the-shelf cloud products as in terms of how my business actually operates? It could be something as simple as Salesforce.com. It could be moving some infrastructure into AWS. It could be a whole range of productivity applications such as Google Apps or Office 365 or whatever it might be. But in reality, I think the organizations or companies that actually start to use those apps, those products, aren't actually integrating them as such. They're just using them. They're not part of the organization anyway. It's just this island of some other thing over here that's in no way connected to your business. And so I think it's important as we consider this world of API first, especially in the context of enterprise IT, because using APIs as a way to tightly connect these cloud-based applications is actually what the end user wants. They want a frictionless experience between your existing on-premise stuff and the new types of cloud applications that they prefer to use today. So this could be as simple as providing single sign-on, or it could be for an organization to better understand how data flows between on-premise data storage and these cloud-based applications. And so you either end up with sort of world of shadow IT, right? This sort of notion that people will go off and do it regardless, and you don't really know what's going on, and so IT has been totally sidelined and is no longer really relevant or part of the picture. Or you can think about APIs first and consider, well, how do I actually leverage and integrate cloud services with the existing IT infrastructure that I have today, and providing a more effective two-way integration between cloud apps and these sort of on-premise things. So cloud adoption is really not the same as cloud integration, and I think this is an important thing to consider when we look at APIs and how your organization becomes API first. The fifth one is security, because I think security is one of these things that nobody really likes to talk about. It's not very glamorous. Every time security makes the news, it's because of something really bad that's happened, right? Security has to actually be thought about up front, in fact. And so, just as an example, not to pick on anybody, if there's anybody from Moonpig or knows anybody from Moonpig, not to pick on these guys in particular, but the things that they were doing were just crazy. And you know, it's really unfortunate that you know, this sort of example makes the news for the fact that, you know, they're doing something so horribly wrong. Security very rarely makes the news when they're doing something right. So, you know, that's the slightly unfortunate perspective of considering API security. And probably a lot of why they were making some bad decisions is because they hadn't really thought about the way their API was going to be used from the very beginning. So I suspect they were building some internal products based on this API, and then when they exposed it to the public, the same principles in which it was being consumed no longer were valid, and so things like you know, using the same user credentials across all APIs was just you know, a really silly thing to do, and became very obvious through basic testing that their API wasn't secure at all. And so I think it's important to think about security up front. When you're designing an API, when you're thinking about your APIs and your API infrastructure and what it means to be API first again, we have to consider how your APIs are going to be used, probably ensure that your security considerations are looking at, you know, how the public may access this API, rather than just assuming that everything's going to be for internal use. And so, you know, security for the real world, it's important to realize that sometimes even the simplest security solutions are best. And it's not always about, you know, authentication and authorization. Basic stuff like rate limiting, so the Snapchat API snafu, let's call it, was, you know, would have been solved and prevented, in fact, from basic rate limiting. If they'd have just implemented that, then they would have been able to see that somebody was, you know, unintentional, or, you know, they were trying to use the API in a way that wasn't intended originally. And so if they'd have been able to catch that very quickly, then the idea of being able to actually retrieve user details or hack everybody's account would never have happened. I think it's also important, again, to think about all of the products that you might be providing access to. So we'll probably hear a little bit more today about identity and access management and how API security as an enabler for other products and other platforms and other environments is really quite important. And providing the same experience and the same level of security across all of those products is important. And I think it's also important to think about access control and security based on business requirements rather than technology constraints. It's quite often been said that security is this, you know, world of where we just say, no, you can't do this, or the only way you can access a certain thing is via VPN. And so, you know, IT and security people get put in this box of always saying no to everything. In reality, it has to be used as an enabler, as a way to make it easy and secure to access your APIs, regardless of the environment, regardless of the products. The final one is again, it's more of an organizational perspective, perhaps, to API first. But this new era of governance, and again, I'm kind of using, or the era of new governance. The ideas of SOA here come to mind because it was a very structured, strict, heavy way to enforce principles and policies onto how developers and applications consumed APIs. And actually, people didn't really like this. Developers rebelled against it entirely. They don't like this strict governance environment. And they certainly don't like to be forced down the path of using specific things. So I think it's important to realize that a sort of more high trust, low friction model is more effective in today's world of APIs and API management versus the older SOA principles. And just to sort of reiterate a point that we mentioned at the very beginning, that functional decomposition of services, this idea of what a service is, should be based on the business rather than an architectural constraint or some technology requirement that you may have had. Sort of associated to this then is the notion that you can and should decentralize everything. So as part of this world of new governance, developers should be able to build whatever they want on any platform, not be forced into a particular technology stack. If it was, always in a world of SOA, then everything you did was kind of stuck in that domain and you couldn't do anything else. And alongside that, we should absolutely be limiting or removing entirely centralized resources. So in a lot of cases, centralized databases, and when I say message queues, I mean centralized, so everybody using the same message queue. I think that technology is still perfectly relevant in certain contexts. I'm just saying a centralized place for everything to be pushed and pulled from doesn't always make sense. And things like enterprise service buses are kind of very much yesteryear's technology, and again, moving away from that centralized model makes good sense. So in quick summary of that, because we're running out of time, the world of digital business requires better flexibility. It requires developers to be able to go off and build what they want. It requires different product teams to be able to make decisions and technology decisions that are free of this central governance notion. And so it must be a lightweight but also effective model for controlling and managing how APIs are consumed. So when we think about API governance or API management, what we're really saying is, it becomes an enabler. We're providing an easy way for people to get access to things, an easy way to integrate cloud services, an easy way to build, some new application for a new type of platform or product. But at the same time retaining visibility and control for the overall organization to know, how services are being used, where they're being used, and how things can perhaps be improved. So those are my six steps. I'm going to quickly recap them just so that you remember. The first one was define a catalog of APIs and manage them as products. So, we're thinking about the services that make sense for the business and how I can define products and new services based on an API-first approach. Think differently about API design, typo, and how your APIs may be used. And so, think about the new types of consumers that may be integrating against your API in the future. Don't be held back by legacy systems. Use API management or some technology to abstract and reuse existing infrastructure rather than be tied or weighed down by it. Integrate the cloud with the cloud completely and consider how visibility across cloud services is important to your business and important to how all applications actually interact with your APIs and with these different products that exist inside the firewall and outside. Consider security as an enabler rather than a barrier, but build it in at the very beginning. Think of it first along with your API. And finally, your APIs and your developers should be equal citizens, both first-class citizens. APIs are the foundation by which everything gets built, and your developers have to be, trusted in order to go off and build what they want in an environment that makes sense for them. And so with that quick summary, I will take questions for maybe a minute or two, I guess.